Welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining Genius Boards this afternoon. Yes, it's this afternoon to most of us, those in our hemisphere and nearby. Thanks very much for joining us. I am Sharon Constançon. I am CEO of Genius Boards and Genius Methods, and we're here to spend a short time together understanding about how COP26, climate change, and all these issues are impacting business today. Our focus is going to be from a perspective of what should boards be doing differently in regulated industries, specific energy industries, certain manufacturing industries, listed companies. Why should life be different as a result of COP26? What should they be thinking of and what should be on their radar as a result of the negotiations and agreements and partnerships that have occurred? The key objectives of COP26 were the following: secure global net zero by mid-century, keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach, adapt to protect communities and natural habitats, mobilize finance, and work together to deliver all of the above. Before the event, before COP26, which was the beginning of November here in Glasgow in the UK, there was a lot of talk about it being a lot of talk, that maybe nothing more would come of it. It would be a bit like some of its predecessor years. But the important part was to try and build on what had come from the Paris Agreement and making sure that from 2015 to 2021, that a real difference was going to be made at this point in time. We're looking to see that some of those outcomes could now be delivered. Those that attended were global leaders from major countries from around the globe. And to that, we also attended a large number of corporates and to a smaller degree, other interested parties, some smaller businesses as well, but that was to a lesser degree. Now, what was achieved? There were debates, there were commitments, there were agreements, there were partnerships, and there were many outcomes from this exercise, which is what we want to spend some time discussing today. And as one quote went, total inclusion must be the foundation upon which this process is built. We are all facing the same climate emergency. We must all be part of the solution. And I think that's something that we need to bring home to business. It's all of our problems, whether we are in our home environments or in our corporate environments. It is important that we all consider the fact that was made by one individual recently, Dr. Patrick Shoin, who is a major medical scientist. And his comments were, we might actually already be too late. We don't know. We just don't know. But if we don't act now, it will be too late rather than it could be too late. You're not here to listen to me. I've done my talking now. It's now for my time to facilitate and ensure that you get to meet our panel and to learn from them, because they're the ones who have the intel and knowledge, not me. So I'd first like to introduce you to John Wade-Smith, who is the head of climate change and energy for the British High Commission. He is based in Pretoria, and he is, I think, probably screening to us from Johannesburg at the moment. Perfect. So we've got him from South Africa, our British High Commissioner. And then I'd like to introduce you to Andrew Skipper. Andrew is head of Africa desk at Hogan Lovells, a big legal firm here in the city. And he's also co-chair of the Africa Investors Group, which is an organization expecting to get very involved in COP27, which will be in Africa in Egypt next year. I'd like to start, John, with you first, if I may. In terms of COP26 in the Glasgow environment, what were the key takeaways in terms of the business impact of COP26 for the UK, for the global economy, and in particular for some of the emerging economies within Africa, and specifically South Africa, which is where you are based at the moment?
Sharon, thanks very much indeed, and hello to you on the call. Yeah, you said right at the start there that that COP26, one of the sort of founding principles of COP26 was around inclusion. And that was incredibly important to us. We were severely challenged through the COVID process that that made some of that process quite challenging. Certainly last year and this year, we tried to sort of do hybrid work, but we thought it was incredibly important that after 2 years, more importantly, 6 years after Paris, that we brought as many people together face to face, because as you set out, the sheer scale of the climate emergency and the fact that we need to act right now. So, one of the things we were delighted about is the fact that, despite the COVID environment, it was the largest number of delegates signed up to a COP, I think, ever. So that was not just a massive challenge from the sort of organisation perspective, but it was a real, I think, searing statement that there is a real wide global interest in using this to drive ambition. And so heading to actually it itself, I mean, you set out, it's 2 goals you set out of the 4. One is about raising the finance, and the other one is about actually bringing 1.5 under in line. And I think my COP president, Alok Sharma, said that we had managed to keep 1.5 alive, but it's on a life support system. So being very honest, on the public finance front, we didn't quite meet the 100 billion that we had committed by 2020 in Copenhagen. In terms of getting to 1.5, you add up all the offers put on the table by the country and the parties together, we are on a pathway to over 2 degrees at the moment. So in some ways, that's a humbling context. But I think what I want to focus on is the fact that, and the takeaway sort of for business being thinking about this, is what actually came away from it was a real impetus back into momentum. When we took over the COP presidency process in 2019, 30% of the countries in the world had net zero targets. By COP26, that was 90%, a clear indication that the world as a whole is now shifting, and with it, the entire economies are shifting with it. If you look at the finance, yes, we make the 100 billion, but we have recommitted, and we believe we'll get the 100 billion by 2020 per year, 2022. But between now and 2025, probably over 500 billion of public finance will be made available. Underpinning that, even more exciting, of course, is actually what's happening as a process of everyone's engagement with this. The Global Finance for Alliance for Net Zero has $130 trillion under assets that are now signed up and are directing at net zero targets. Those are things that are fundamentally going to shift and drive economies. You mentioned the fact that about inclusion, and you talked about nature. 130 countries pledged the end deforestations. In terms of the net zero, again, speaking direct to business, the Race for Zero campaign, 82 countries, 5,200 businesses, 1,000 cities, 441 financial institutions have all identified net zero. So you can see that there is a real shift and a momentum, and that's driven by consumer, public participation. We had the youth involved who made it very, very clear they expect governments, they expect businesses to be fundamentally shifting. So I could go on for days. I'm not going to, because that'll bore your audience. I think the key thing is, if we get away from the absolute headlines, did you make 100 billion? Did you make 1.5? Being very honest, no. Is 1.5 alive? Very much so. We need action, we need drive. But if you look at what's happening, how the non-state actors are demanding change, the non-state actors are putting the money in driving investments in low carbon economy. If you look at the way in which policy is now going to drive the way investment and trade is going to go, things like net zero vehicles or zero emission vehicles, we are going to phase them out by 2030 in the UK. Not them in the combustion engine, but by 2030 it's zero emission vehicles. Same in Europe. That's a fundamental impact on not just car motor manufacturing, but the downstream supply chains that need to now move in that direction. So I think my final comment on this before we go further is that COP26, I think, sent a clear message. And I think you said that, Sharon, right at the start, which is everyone is part of this. And COP26 demonstrated they are. And that ambition for net zero is gathering momentum, gathering pace. For emerging economies, certainly like South Africa, I think the message I have is look outside, look in the direction the world is going, look where the investments are going. And what does that mean for how you in this country and in Africa can ensure they are part of that transition. So part of creating the new low carbon economy that will be competitive in this new global reality we're creating and attract the kind of investments. Doubling down on this sort of current way in which the economy works is not going to set up for long-term sustainable growth and development. So I think that's the message: is look what's happening, be part of the revolution.
Wonderful energy. I love to see it. And I don't know how much of this energy is because it all happened in the UK and therefore we feel the energy differently by being the host country. But I do have to say, it does feel like it belongs more to us generally as a human race than this problem has ever felt that it belongs to all of us. And if we can all keep that front of mind, it'll help corporates to do their piece alongside governments and leaders. To the audience, please, if you've got any questions that I'll pick up at the end, please put them into either the chat or the Q&A function. Happy to pick them up towards the end of our conversation. Andrew, I'm going to actually come across to you at this point and just ask you, you were up in COP and you were there amongst the people, the energy, the activity, the noise, the chaos, I think was the word you used when I tried to chat to you when you were up there. Can you just give us an overview of what sort of came out of COP being there for you, for business, for the UK, for the partnerships in the world that have been made? Just a high-level overview, give us some direction.
Sure, thanks, Sharon. Great summary by both you and John, actually. I think it was, being there was not something everybody had the opportunity to do. I was in the green zone, which is the one which, as I put it, got it done. The blue zone was for talking, not blaring, but talking and organizing that. And I was there for 2 days, and heaven only knows how people survive for 2 weeks. I think, but the point is that I think the UK did a really good job in terms of, with a lot of flack, pulling it together. Janet Rogan, for example, who I was, believe it or not, at college with many years ago on the Africa side, I think was there were a lot of very tired people at the end. And I think that although, as ever with these things, people say, "Oh, well, nothing's happened," the answer is that it's momentum, I think, and I think there is momentum there. And I think momentum combines with what the public sector, and this was more about the high-level public sector policy side, but the momentum is bringing along the private sector, and I think particularly with the Mark Carney group, which John has already mentioned, that could be the biggest thing which happened, almost bringing those banks and financial sector together to because it's going to make access to capital dependent to a large extent on compliance with net zero, ESGs and things like that. So I think that's something which very clearly comes out of it. I was actually there, and I have to say this because I was there promoting the amazing project, the Great Green Wall, which everybody should engage with, look at. It's the reforestation of the Sahel, which in itself will bring so many carbon credits you couldn't imagine it. And I believe Jeff Bezos may invest, which will be the biggest offset in history from his trip to space, I think. So I think that's, so it's these sort of things. But if you're looking at it, I don't know when there's 5 areas, I think, which I could focus on, which I will touch very briefly on. Firstly, governments have been committing to things which will have a direct impact on business, both in terms of the obvious ones around coal, to the looking for people to declare net zero, very specifically looking at substantiated climate disclosure, which is going to be massive for companies in terms of when it comes in, that they will have to disclose things, because at the moment, I don't know if people have seen, but people like the FD have been very derogatory, frankly, and as have the stock exchange, about the sort of statements being put out by a lot of companies at the moment in terms of their ESG credentials, and bringing some sort of standardization to that, which can, like people are doing with impact around ESG. That's going to be massive. And a speedier transition for heavy users, I think. But everybody's looking at this now. We're a law firm. We're looking at it. Lots of other people are looking at it. I think I would say, with my Africa hat on, that we need to be very careful, I think, in the rest of the world. The number 3% has been thrown at me very, very many times in the last few weeks, which is the contribution of Africa to the problem is about 3%, let's say. And they are suffering in Africa a lot worse than, or potentially a lot worse, and they have no power. Without power, you can't industrialize. Without industrialization, you don't have jobs. And without jobs, you have all the problems we're seeing at the moment, whether it's across the Sahel or everywhere else. So there has to be a fair or a just transition. And the transition isn't just from coal and gas, it's from burning trees, and burning wood is the highest I believe the biggest fuel use in Africa at the moment is not from either coal or gas, but is from just chopping down trees. So there has to be an acceptance of that. So I think that will come there. I think the next point is, just shut me up if you're getting bored, by the way. But I think there's everybody knows they have to do better, and it's a bit better isn't good enough now. And the reason for that is not because government are telling them, but because stakeholders within companies are shouting this out, whether it's activist shareholders, whether it's the people who work for us are demanding to work in an organization which cares about this sort of thing. And therefore, it's really important to companies and therefore to boards to make sure they get with the program very quickly. This isn't an option for companies. This is what everybody is demanding, whether it's your customers, if you're in consumer sales, etc. And it goes all the way down to that. And it goes down to access to capital as well, because if you don't show the right approach, your access to capital becomes much narrower. Now, obviously, coal-fired power stations will be financed somewhere, but the financing for them is extremely difficult to get hold of now. So then you look at the 100 billion we talked about, well, and we've already talked about the GFANZ or whatever, the Glasgow Financial Alliance, which will make a big difference to access to capital. It'll have an impact on how businesses do their work. I think the next point, which I think was picked up around the edges. I had dinner with the president of Namibia, where they're doing a lot of green hydrogen, for example, at the moment. And green hydrogen, you can argue whether it's a good thing or not, whether you should just use solar or turn solar, but what it produces is essentially carbon credits as well as power. It produces clean power and carbon credits, which can then be traded globally in order to offset and make money two ways in that way. So I think that's very important. Egypt are doing the same as well. I was talking to them the other day too. And finally, picking up on the deforestation point. So, don't forget biodiversity, which is all part of what they're talking about. Convention on Biological Diversity, I think it was on the 11th of October. And really important to sign up to that as well as part of ESG. So those are the sort of broad takeouts I take. Critical for business, not optional, but don't preach, I think I would say to the West, because Africa and emerging markets have it really difficult, and there's an element of, and this will come in COP27, I'm sure, someone's got to pay for it, and it should be those who cause the trouble.
And picking up on those who need to pay for it, John, you did make reference to Mark Carney's organization, conglomerate of banks. When it comes to paying for it, have we got some success out of this last event? Will those funds be able to be accessible that have been promised? And I allude to things like infrastructure development in Africa, or even here within the UK. If the matching the activist demand, investors' demands for clean, green, and we haven't quite got it at the investment level, are they going to struggle with that last sort of not being able to cross the last T and therefore be able to access funds? Is it going to become more difficult?
I mean, it's a very good question, and I think the answer is, let me go back quickly to something Andrew pointed out, which is about the unique position that Africa finds itself in, and the fact that they contributed very little to the global
incredible stats
problem with photo. Yeah, I mean, it's 100% right, and there are a couple of other really important things that came out of COP26. One of which was a just transition declaration that we got other development partners to be signing up to, which essentially will ensure that the drive for a great green growth, grow better, will be one that is embedded in the social impacts and the justice that is absolutely essential for Africa as a whole. We've also put a very high price on adaptation, and we've agreed internationally that the climate finance that's been made available, it's going to be equally or more equitably shared between mitigation, which is sometimes easier to understand how you spend money in building a wind farm, reducing or increasing efficiency, but also adaptation, which is absolutely critical for South Africa and for Africa as a whole in terms of preparing, building resilience and responding to the climate crisis that's happening today. So greater money is being made available on the adaptation front for Africa, and there's work going on now to see not how to scale up, but how do you ease access to finance on those areas, which I think is really important. I think the other thing that's important is to recognise the fact that embedded in the whole UN process is this thing called a common but differentiated responsibilities. There's a recognition embedded in the negotiation process that we are where we are today, and we have a global requirement to try and address the carbon emission process and try to halt the worst cases of climate change, but that there's been an inequitable contribution to that from the developed world who have caused most of it. And therefore, there's a great responsibility on them to be not just paying for developing countries to help deal with their green growth agenda, their adaptation, their resilience, but also for us to go bigger and quicker in terms of reducing emissions. And that also feeds into what Africans, developing economies, need to do in terms of growing their economy. And this is why this process of having these nationally determined contributions is so important, where they set out quite clearly what the adaptation process, what their emissions profile look like up to 2030. And within it, you can define, in order to get there, what needs to happen. And that will include the fact that you need to build infrastructure, as well as taking coal out of the economy over time. So I think where countries are able, and this is going back to, again, the importance that Andrew touched on with all corporations looking to access finances, where you can demonstrate that the planning, the construction is linked to a sort of sustainable process, the money, I think, will be there and will look to come and quickly. Where it is carelessly put together with no great understanding of the sustainability aspects of projects, that is where money will be more difficult to access. Andrew did mention about the fact that coal will be financed somehow. We generally hope that new coal is not an issue, because certainly the developed economy, the G20, have stopped financing coal, and so has now China has agreed to stop internationally financing coal. So you can see where the money, the scale of the money we've talked about, the focus of the money, and where people can demonstrate programs and projects, infrastructure and otherwise, necessary for development, sustainable development, requires financing. I think it will come. It's not really like a magic money tree, but it's going to come. It won't make it more difficult. It will only make it more difficult for those projects, those companies that are not able to demonstrate they're responding in any way at all to the sustainable challenge we've got through climate change.
I suppose that addresses that one key point, is mobilizing finance and work together to deliver it. But the important part is to protect communities and natural habitats. You talked about that green corridor, Andrew, and I was at one of your conferences recently where this was discussed in far more detail. An absolutely fascinating discussion looking at this literally snake of trees going across the Saharan desert or somewhere similar to
just
that.
Below the Sahel.
Just below the Saharan desert. It's quite an incredible little thing. It's the Great Wall of China has got something to worry about in terms of what can be seen from way out there. Andrew, you talked about, I think it was John, you talked about the quality and the importance of disclosure that is going to be required by organizations one of you discussed it. I can't remember now actually who it was. But the importance of disclosure. Now, if you go back in governance terms about 4 or 5 years ago, and we were talking about the kind of disclosures boards would put into their annual report relative to the board evaluation exercise, it was very much a very stock standard boilerplated type response, which, given the comment that was made now, is that the market is expecting something a lot more definitive by organizations. How should the board be focusing its mind on that disclosure aspect? What should they be doing that their young stakeholder staffs are demanding, that investors are demanding, that they can deliver and can talk about? Maybe Andrew?
Yeah, but firstly, if I can go back to John's point about the financing, I think we're, as John will know, we're possibly 2 days early in terms of the UK, because on Thursday, as Nick O'Donoghue and the Foreign Secretary will be announcing the CDC's new strategy for the next 5 years. And I had a chat with Nick, which there's a podcast going out on that in the next 24 hours, but which doesn't cover that. So it's something to prepare. But CDC are both the first ever DFI and pretty much the biggest investor in Africa, and they're the UK's DFI. And so what they're going to be doing is putting money, very clearly focusing their money in line with the government, the UK government, because they own it and we own it, with their strategies. So I think that's something for people to look out for on Thursday morning at the stock exchange at around about 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning. I think when the Foreign Secretary will be making that announcement with Nick. I think the other point going back is that, and this is a leitmotif, as it were, for emerging markets, is you can't do it on your own as public sector, and the public sector has to do it with the private sector, and it has to be a partnership, whether you call it blended finance or however you call it, and everybody acknowledges that. And I think that the challenge, and this is probably not for this discussion, the challenge is to make sure the multilaterals and the DFIs work sufficiently closely with the private sector to allow the private sector to do their job and the DFIs to do their job, in terms of DFIs essentially development, de-risking things, and then the private sector working with them to develop projects and develop things that they want to do. So I think that goes back, and that leads into where the private sector then comes in. You asked, what does the private sector do? Well, the private sector, firstly, if you're on the board, you have to, as I said, get with the program. ESG is here to stay, and you need to embrace it as a board because everybody's expected you to. Now, that's not a reporting thing, that's a cultural thing, that it's not an add-on. And for example, a lot of people are putting ESG right up front in terms of strategy and policy and board membership effectively. And so that's the first thing. And second thing is to be, as a board, don't be reactive, because you'll lose out then. So be proactive and make sure you've got a GC, no doubt, who can keep you informed, know what's going on, but not just at the legal level, but at the policy level. Now, obviously, this, only large companies and large organizations will have the ability to do all that. But if you're in an organization, if you're in a company which is part of a trade body or something like that, they will be, and if they're not, they should be, and you should push them to do this, providing you with regular updates on ESG proposals, whether it's related to COP26 or otherwise, because it's not just environment, it's supply chain issues on the S side of ESG, massive issues around that, which we're seeing all the time, and you really have to know what's going on in there, and just keep up to date with everything. I think then, depending on what sort of organization you are, you will have to report it, and people are doing their best, but they're being accused of greenwashing effectively at the moment. So in order to avoid being accused of greenwashing, start looking at things like TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and sort of the recommendations they're looking at. So look at that sort of disclosure, and it will be standardized, because at the moment it's, I think the authorities would argue it's all over the place, which means that there's a challenge. So get with the program as a board, understand that. We can talk about practical steps which might be taken on a subsequent question, but this is a board. The big point is this is a board issue. Your stakeholders are interested in it. Know what's coming up and be prepared to deal with it across the ESG space.
Thank you. Before I move on to another question to you, John, is there something you'd like to respond in that same space as well?
No, I think it's covered that, and covered that really well. I mean, I think so. I was just thinking as I was listening to him talk, Andrew, you talk, that I remember when I was back in South Africa in about 2009. I went to what was a carbon disclosure project annual awards, and they were handing out awards to companies that had presented the most detailed and the best disclosure of their carbon emissions during the course of the year. And I went that year, and I also went back the following year, and I watched many of the same companies come up and get awards, same thing. And I remember asking at the time, which was, is there an award for the company that's demonstrated they've actually reduced their emissions in that period, rather than just simply, and there's like, oh, I never really thought about that. So that stuff fundamentally shifted in the 10 or 12 years since then, which is, it's not good enough just to understand your emissions. It's about, or your profile, it's understanding what you can do to curb that, understanding your customer base, what they're looking for. Do you understand what your stakeholders are looking for, and at what stage? It's not just the end products, it's the whole value chain. And I think the one thing is, of course, is also, the board has to have a good communication strategy. It's not about just the actual reporting, but it's really imperative that it's a board function around embedding ESG into its thinking, and also in terms of how it speaks, how it's presenting itself as a company that understands the importance of sustainability, understands the importance of playing its role as part of the new low carbon global economy. So I think we've touched on the things that need to be hardwired in a board. Where I think 8 years ago, 5 years ago, there was often one person told, by the way, can you keep an eye on this, please? And that's
exactly, and it goes to who's on the board and whose responsibilities are on the board, I think, which is sort of Sharon's area of concern, I think. But if you've got somebody in HR 3 steps down looking after ESG, that ain't going to do it. So, this is important stuff now.
I think a lot of non-executive directors who pick up this mantle and this passion and recognize its true value and operate interactively with their board and with the organizations on which they are a NED can actually start to shift the culture, even on boards where they don't necessarily have this front of mind yet. I think there's work for chairman, there's work for non-execs, and there's work for the executives within the organization.
Just to be clear, it's a big personal reputational issue if you're on a board of a company which isn't doing the right thing.
It's reputationally from quite a few angles. One is you're going to lose your customer or your staff.
Yeah, but personally, if you're an NED on that sort of thing, and you don't want to be stuck with the sort of flack flying around which happens occasionally, whether it's on modern slavery, whether it's supply chain, whether it's environment, or whatever it is. You need to keep on a personal level as a board member. You've got to keep on the ball.
And thank you for reminding us about our personal legal responsibility, reputation, fiduciary duty. Thank you, lawyer. Appreciate that input.
That's why I always go on advisory boards when I can.
Very, very useful input, very much so. John, we were talking just before we got started, and one of the earlier announcements in COP was the Just Energy Transition agreement that was announced between South Africa, UK, US, France, Germany, EU. I think I've got all of them. Can you just give us as an example, that was one agreement. What was its value? What's it going to do differently? And were there many other kinds of partnership agreements of that nature?
Well, thanks for that. So, I mean, I think we believe this is a kind of unique agreement. And I think the president made it clear that he, like we do, see this as possibly being a kind of model that others may look to try and get behind. I mean, the genesis of this was, going back over a year, a very clear statement from the South African government that, any form of ambition needed to come with a high degree of support. This is an emerging economy. We all understand the challenges it's facing in terms of unemployment and debts and inequality, plus COVID has hammered it as well. So, and we began this whole conversation around, you need to access finance. Finance is going to back ambition. Finance is not going to flood where there is no ambition, where it's kind of status quo ante. You need to inspire to attract. South Africa did that. I think it's really worth noting here that South Africa went through a lengthy stakeholder process around their national determined contribution offer. They brought that out, I think, in April. It was not, we didn't see it as being highly ambitious at all. We understand where it's coming from, but it didn't have that ambition. And that also elicited quite an interesting response, including from business. I think Booster at the time were like, this is good enough. Thank you very much indeed. We have to protect our growth model. We have to, we're a fragile economy. But then during that 5-6 month period of stakeholder engagement, it allowed lots of other voices and modeling to really demonstrate the fact that there was a real opportunity for South Africa to be able to lift its ambition. And with that, we were saying, we're genuinely interested in supporting that ambition. So the two that came out, one is South Africa came out with a national determined contribution, which was significantly shifted and is now aligned at its weakest to 2 degrees, which is pretty good for an emerging economy, and at its most ambitious to 1.5 degrees. So they really have kind of set, South Africa have come forward again and once again reaffirmed its climate leadership in this forum, but made it very clear that, obviously the range is what they'd like to go to. 1.5 would be great, but they're never going to get there without support. And that was a kind of challenge to the global community, which is, we put it out there, we want to go big, need support, what are you going to do? And I think what we did was we brought together these 4 countries and the EU together, just to go, well, let's explore how, as international community, how might we combined and coordinated be able to sort of really throw significant support behind a real ambition that was set by South Africa. And so that process took place. There are a couple of unique things. I think the fact that back in, I think it was September, we had the 4 countries in the EU represented at their sort of senior climate envoy status, sitting together, talking to a group of ministers from South Africa, cross-departmental, talking together over what South Africa's ambitions were and what the potential contribution might be as that negotiation process started. But having 5 countries merged together to talk on one issue with a country, having a number of government departments sitting around the table, speaking as one about what they want as the country's direction, I think was unique. And I think that itself is a real strong message about the need for a government direction, not just a departmental one, because we know from every country, including the UK, that one government may do one department may do one thing, the other may see it differently. So I think it was really important. So, $8.5 billion has been put on the table between the next 3 and 5 years. It is from a variety of sources. It's some grant funding, some blended finance, some highly concessionary finance. But the key point is the UK, US, France, Germany, and the EU have together identified where 8.5 billion can be directed towards South Africa to support a just energy transition. So there's some of it is around decommissioning and accelerating that, but it's also recognizing the fact that transition is not just about cutting coal off, it's about recognizing the social impact, supporting the people who are directly impacted by the communities. It's also expanded to touch on things like green hydrogen and electric vehicles as well, both incredibly important. Electric vehicles, important for South Africa to protect its automotive industry, which at the moment is important, but it's internal combustion. And green hydrogen, it's a real potential growth area. So we think it's very important. There's still lots of work to do in terms of understanding exactly how the facility is structured, what exactly the South African's program of activities is going to be, and how do you merge both. the commitment on both sides, I think, is there. And as you said, I mean, I think it's interesting that we were still hearing people refer to it deep into COP and at the end of COP, because it kind of stood out as a sort of a moment of, it took a lot of people by surprise. And I'm glad staff was part of it, because it showed just what you can do with determination, political unity, a clear focus, and ambition.
Thank you. That is actually very inspiring. You used that word a little earlier. Andrew, you spoke a moment ago saying there's some practical applications we could use for another question. So the question I ask is, there's environment, there's social, which has a much bigger context, and there's governance, which has a bigger context as well, as has the E for environment. What are the practical things that you would look at, let's say, as a law firm versus a manufacturing organization versus a power generator? How could we, as those three organizations, do things differently at an ESG level?
I think the same principles apply, because we all use power. You know, we all have buildings, and we all have staff, and we all buy things, and we sell things. We just sell different things. So I think the same principles will apply. But obviously, if you're a power company, then you're right at the, as it were, at the cold face of all the issues that you could possibly imagine. So, I mean, what I was thinking, you know, the sort of thing I'm thinking of just in board terms is, you know, putting this on the board agenda all the time, having and sorry, picking up your point of that the governance side of things is increasingly important, because you're looking at diversity on the board, you're looking at general diversity on the board, you're looking at board pay, you're looking at all the fair, you know, all the things which you need to get right at a governance level. We haven't really talked about that today, but that's absolutely critical, and those are being picked up obviously all day long by activist shareholders and by everybody else. So those are really important. Social is the social, how you do deliver that. Particularly, I think that's being picked up on, you know, the really difficult issues around supply chain. Now, those relate both to doing the right thing on supply chain, looking, you know, where, you know, and the focus there has obviously been on China, and that's not only for the social reasons, that's for the practical reasons of what happens if a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal and things like that. So there's areas around that which are really important. But I think those will, with the demographic changes, those will drive, how you might put it, not a complete change, but a slight disaggregation of the global supply chain, to move to where you're, you know, where you might be dual sourcing and things like that. I mean, I started a very, very long time ago, and I worked for some of the biggest manufacturing companies in the world, and on the supply chain side, the first rule was always don't single source, don't dual source. Then it was, you know, just in time may work, but what happens if a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal? And all the things which we all learned how to keep a business running efficiently went out of the window due to the marginal gains, as Dave Brailsford would have said, in terms of just changing things. You make a bit more money, but then when you get hit, you get really hit hard, whether it's because, you know, people say you can't buy things from a particular factory, or the factory burns down, or things like that. So I think those are really important aspects of that, which are board issues, because they're existential issues. I mean, most of the ESG things are existential and therefore have to be put on the board. And I think you need to, if you're advising the board or you're on the board, you need to continue, you know, you've got your risk register, put that right at the front of that. Review your policies regularly on that, identify gaps in your processes and cover them off. Make sure your reporting isn't going to get you into trouble, whether for greenwashing or simply, you know, not saying the right thing. And if you're doing acquisitions, make sure you check all that and run through it very, very carefully. Build climate change into your strategy. I mean, as I say, you asked the question about, I mean, we do pretty much, because we have stakeholders who are our clients and our staff, and they expect us very clearly to do the right thing, not only for, you know, for our teams and everybody else. So that works, and understand what the metrics are, because there's a whole load of sort of waffle talks around these areas. So you need to get to grips with what the metrics are, and we're getting there, I think, but we're not there yet. So those are the sort of things I'd be looking at.
Okay, that gives us some ideas as a board to break the E, the S, and the G down, and then once again take it down into the levels that go below that, because that's where you actually are going to be making the difference. And you talked about stakeholders, you talked about your team having a demand of you. People say it's the youth. Yes, it might be more outspoken.
I think it's everyone now.
Yeah, exactly. It's outspoken by
even
the youth.
even older folks.
People now are saying it's not good enough to do it in the wrong way. And you were talking about reputation earlier, and it's getting to that stage where it's almost if you don't, that's the issue, rather than you should be doing. We've gone 80-20 the other way now. How do you see, either of you, Andrew or John, do you see from an investor's point of view, we talked about green investing, and we talk about green deposit bonds and things like those kind of investments that are green related. How are those achieved, and how does that make a difference to a company that's investing, to investors in their private capacities? What is it that they can look at to say, is this greenwashing? Is it genuine? Am I making a difference investing in this asset or that asset?
Well, on the first point is it's quite difficult to work that out. Yeah. And that's why they're coming up with the powers that be, quite rightly, are coming up with standardization of reporting, because otherwise it's difficult to tell. I mean, people tell me that if you're investing in Africa, it has to have an impact on one of the E, S, or G. So all investment in Africa, for example, is impact. But you need to then break it down a bit from that. So I think that, but if you're looking at, the city, speaking with my AIG hat on, the city is a fantastic place. The City of London is an amazing place and it's driving green financing. There's a lot of green financing going on. There's green bonds being issued in emerging markets like Ghana, for example. What Gabon have done is extraordinary in terms of their essentially, securitization is the wrong word, but what they've done is they protect their forests by creating effectively carbon credits out of that, which they can then trade elsewhere. So there's all sorts of ways of doing it. But firstly, I'm not an investment advisor, and secondly, I don't think we're not there yet where it's very easy for frankly, the man on the street to be able to work out what's right, because I don't think it's not fully fledged yet, I would say. I don't know what you think about that, John.
No, I think you're right. In addition to what you're saying, I think there's quite a lot of work going on around green taxonomy and sort of.
Yes, absolutely.
And we're doing that. Certainly in South Africa, one of the programs we're running here is to try and understand how you can simplify and clarify green taxonomy, so that if you are an investor, from an investment house to a company to an individual, you have a much clearer link between what actually constitutes green investment. And so I think the tools at the disposal of so the demand is there, and as Andrew said, it's not just youth. I think it's everyone demanding it. I saw a poll the other day in America which says something like 68% of all the highly empowered consumers now look to amplify and patronize brands that reduce environmental impact. So 68% of the high-powered consumers are directly looking to either consume, patronize, or amplify brands that have a clear reduction in environmental impact. Now that tells any business that they need to be shifting with this need. And as I said, the tools are being developed. The tools are able to understand what constitutes a green investment, and then the actual products themselves, the green bonds and other forms of green financing, are increasingly being developed. We're looking again at municipal levels here in South Africa about trying to work out how you get this sort of the second tier municipalities, the ones that are battling with debt and everything else, but they shouldn't be precluded from accessing some form of green finance to try and drive, self-generated embedded power that is renewable. So again, we're looking at tools about how we can make green finance more accessible to them as well. So as I think Andrew said, the need is clear, the demand is clear, and the tools are improving all the time.
Yeah.
One of the things that in a governance ambit space is talking about having a stakeholder representative on a board. Now, whether that is the stakeholder as in the staff, which is often a voice required at the board, and how that can be done. There's been lots of discussions about the how, what, and wherefore. But the importance there is the board needs to listen to its stakeholders, whether it is the customer, the supplier, the staff, the regulator, wherever those respective stakeholders are, is how are they listening to those voices? How are they receiving those messages? How are they collating that information they're getting from so many different points of view? And then using that to build their decision-making, their fiduciary duty responsibilities, and ensuring that as a company they are responding positively and proactively, the word one of you used earlier, to that kind of messaging that's coming in, because so often they hear it and they're ignoring it. I think suddenly the pandemic has brought a change. We're not just hearing it with closed ears, we're listening to it. And the market, I sense in boardrooms, is starting to say, this is real, we're going to have to take it seriously. So that is the journey through of the private sector. You were talking about the public-private partnership type of activity that is going on. But as our final statements from individuals, any specific topic either of you have got on your list that I haven't picked up on yet? Andrew?
No,
I know you had some good prep work there.
No, but just picking up your last point, I mean, just this applies whether it's a board or not. Where you make mistakes, and you may have seen this politically in the last week or so, if everybody in the room is violently in agreement and you just have an echo chamber, you end up making mistakes, and obvious mistakes. So having and with ESG, it's very easy to convince yourself you're doing the right thing. And you need a contrarian or a contrary view somewhere. You don't want everybody to be the same, which goes back to diversity. So diversity on the boards is absolutely, both in terms of where you come from, where you've been brought up, and views. Because if you have that, people can challenge each other in a constructive way, and you don't end up making stupid mistakes, which if you sit around negotiating a contract all night, you all reach violent agreement that that's the obvious way to do it, and you really need your mum or somebody to come in and say that's just obviously stupid. And you say, oh yeah, it is, isn't it? So you just change your mind. So I'd say make sure you don't end up with an echo chamber, because you'll all agree violent with each other and probably get it wrong.
I think the importance of cognitive diversity, age diversity, you referenced background diversity, but the importance in boards is to actually step up and speak up. And if you're not happy, you're not sure, you don't think the board's going far enough, isn't this the time that we should be, as non-executive directors, as chairman, leading organizations and saying, but why aren't we? What can we? What are the things we can do differently? What does our customer want? What does our stakeholder want? And I think these are conversations that have been avoided up until this point. And hopefully something that has changed in our pandemic environment has brought this more conclusively to the boardroom. So hopefully we don't have what you were referring to, Andrew. We talk about groupthink and blind spots. We don't need either of them in our boardrooms.
No.
John, anything you'd like to add to that conversation?
Yeah, I just think we've spent a lot of time over this last hour sort of focusing on what boards need to do and what companies do. I think that one of the things that we can draw from the experience in the UK is that we were the first developed economy to put climate ambition into law. We have some of the most ambitious climate reduction strategies there are, and we have high ambition set for us by an independent, or not set for us, advised to government by an independent body that kind of sets out what our missions should be like. And where this came from, I think, is the fact that going back over a decade now, the link between business and government was strong, where businesses were saying to the government, we hear you, we understand, give us policy certainty, deliver on what you have said, help us make the decisions, because we'll make the right decisions if it's a policy certain environment, but if you're going to sort of leave it wishy-washy, we weren't going to take that risk. So I think there is also something about boards having a clear understanding of where they want to go. But what do they need? What do they need from government in terms of policy environment and the other sort of incentives to help drive that? So I think that two-way thing about externally voicing a big part of the narrative. Don't wait for government because they'll be too slow. Don't expect government to do the right things because no government in the world does the right things by update by accident, but by information and by challenge. And I think that will, it's that symbiosis between the drive of business, the determination of government, the right policies being formed by business saying, help us to deliver what you want us to deliver and where we want to go.
A two-way traffic conversation, as government being such a key stakeholder in creating that foundation that we talked about right in the beginning, the inclusiveness of business, so that we can do the right things in the E space, which is what we've been talking a lot about, but equally in the governance space and the social space around our communities and our direct environments that we impact. Andrew, a final statement from you, if you would like.
No, I think I said it with my echo chamber, which I'm a great, I like a contrary view.
I do like that one. I also have the story of the 12 angry men, and you had the one jury individual turning around and saying, no, I disagree. It cannot be done without reasonable doubt. And how the whole jury changed its view because everybody was into groupthink. And one person said, have you looked at? And it was the mark on the person's nose for their glasses, if I remember correctly. And it's how people will just follow a leader, follow the one they think who knows more, rather than having their own independent mind. John, closing comment from you?
I think I've covered it. I think that
you've covered it all.
It's,
goodness,
it's two ways, and
I depleted you both.
Forward.
Depleted you both before, or as the hour is up. And the key takeaways that I picked up from this conversation, what I really appreciated is we all talk about some of the sort of silly things about what business can do, but what we got into here was actually into the nuggets of what a board needs to think, right from reputation to stakeholder management to brand management to their own sustainability, because if they don't, their sustainability effectively is what you gentlemen have been talking about, is they can't be sustainable if their stakeholders are not going to support them. So they need to have that two-way understanding of what the stakeholder demands are in this space. We talked about disclosure, we talked about the public-private partnership aspect, and the importance, there was a word you used, Andrew, around culture in the boardroom. And I think that's probably, if anything, one of the strongest messages we need to take away from here, is to build the right culture, that it's in the DNA of the business, and working with our government's policy, regulatory environments, to build a better place for boards to operate and for the right thing to be done. Once again, comments made by yourselves.
Thank you.
I would like to thank both of you and to the team who got involved in making today happen. John, it's been a pleasure to meet you. I've heard of you for so long from many, many sources. And Andrew, a stalwart friend in many aspects in my business life. Thank you very much, both of you, for what was really innovative, genuine, day-to-day practical insights as to how we can all make a difference. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.